Hi, welcome back to Gronsky Books. Now, like all of you, I have read a lot of really great books in my life. Books that excite me, books that change the way I look at the world around me, and books that change the way that I write. But we're not talking about any of these books today. We're going to talk about some of the bad books that I've read over the last few years. Now, I never intended for this channel to be a place for bad book reviews. By and large, I want to talk about books that I find to be of value, books that I find to be enlightening to me as a reader and inspirational to me as a writer. But recently I came across this video from Alan Moore. He's the author of Watchmen, V for Vendetta, From Hell, Jerusalem, other books. Here, let me get out of the way, make some room for him so you can hear what he has to say.
I would urge you to not only read good books, read terrible books as well.
Now, he actually goes on to say that when you read these bad books, you should find examples of clumsiness and bad thinking that spoiled the story for you, so that you can avoid these mistakes in your own writing. Now, I don't have the best memory, and so after I've read a book, a few years passes, and whether I like the book or not, the details around that book start to fade a little bit. So I've been keeping a book journal for the last couple of years, and whether I like the book or not, I take notes on it and I write down what I like about the book, what I didn't like about the book, what worked for me, what didn't work for me. And that way, when I go back and when the book has started to fade from my memory, I can refresh myself. Instead of having to reread a whole book, I can read my notes. The benefit there is that I'm actually able to recall a great deal more about the book than is even written in my notes when I read my notes, as brief as they often are. But what I'm using my book journal for today is that I've combed through the last couple of years and I've extracted 10 lessons that I have learned as a writer from reading bad books. Now, whether you're a writer or you're just trying to become a more discerning reader, these lessons can be of use to you. Now, I'm not really trying to bash these books per se. Many of the authors of these books have gone on to write other books that are really good. It's just that these books in particular didn't really work for me. Now, 3 quick things before we get started. 1, this is not an exhaustive list of every bad book that I've ever read. 2, these are not the worst books that I have ever read. And 3, spoilers ahead for all of these books. We all know the plot of Maze Runner, I'm sure. One great big group of young boys penned in a forest clearing by these gigantic, unscalable walls at the center of an enormous maze. They have been imprisoned by mysterious forces. They don't know by who. To further complicate things, they've all lost their memories. It is a mystery within a mystery, which brings us to lesson number 1. Even if you are planning sequels, don't withhold all the answers. You see, if I'm reading The Maze Runner, I'm reading The Maze Runner. I haven't yet committed to reading The Scorch Trials or anything else that comes after that in the series. It's James Dasher's job as the author to convince me to read the other books in the series if he wants that to happen. And to be fair, a lot of people did read the other books, but I didn't. And here's why. The central mystery at the core of Maze Runner is just as mysterious to the characters as it is to the reader. And as the characters toil to find answers to the mystery, they only find more questions. Who built the robot creatures inside the maze? Why does the maze keep changing? Why can't they get out? Is there a way out? Why can't they remember anything? Why are they selected once a month? We start the novel literally in the dark. By the end of chapter 2, we know the situation, but by page 200, we basically don't know anything more. Now, to be fair, by the very, very, very end of the book, we've learned a few critical things, but it all comes at the very, very, very end, and it ends on a cliffhanger, a setup for the next book. That's not a satisfying end to the first book, but it's a tantalizing beginning to the first sequel. But a good first book in a series can do both. And it can accomplish that dual feat by rewarding the reader with answers. My advice is that, let's say you have 10 mysteries you're going to reveal over the course of your series. Don't try to set them all up in book one. Spread it out, or kind of hint very subtly at some of the other mysteries to come, such that only in retrospect did you realize that you were being set up for another mystery. Be clever about it. Let it sink in slowly. Getting bludgeoned over the head with questions without the satisfaction of being fed some answers was frustrating enough, at least in this situation, for me to DNF the series. Other than that, The Maze Runner was kind of a fun book. Just watch the movies, I guess. The Killing Floor is the first book in Lee Child's famous Jack Reacher series that spans 27 novels, and it's the only one that I've read. The Jack Reacher character has appeared in film and TV adaptations, and like I said, there's 27 of these books. So by any accounting, it's a phenomenal success. But I still think The Killing Floor is a bad book. Lesson number 2. Just because it's in the thriller genre doesn't mean it has to be written at a 3rd grade reading level. Lee Child has bragged that he could write literary fiction if he wanted to, but that literary writers couldn't write a thriller if they tried. I guess he knows this. But we'll never know what Lee Child is really capable of as long as he keeps writing so that any 10-year-old can read his books. Seriously, and with no exaggeration whatsoever, The Killing Floor is written at the exact same level, I mean with more bad swears and more violence, but it's written at the exact same reading level as, say, like Hatchet or like Wonder. And actually, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone is written at a higher reading level, if only because the average sentence length exceeds 4 words. And actually, who's to say that thrillers can't have literary pretensions? Neil Stephenson's done it, and there's Donna Tartt and Patricia Highsmith and Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and John LeClaire and Daphne du Maurier and Thomas Pynchon and Celeste Ng. So go ahead, Mr. Lee Child. Don't worry about us. Go ahead and write your literary thriller. We're waiting. Up next is The Fireman by Joe Hill. And this is probably the book that I have the most to talk about. This is the first book that came to mind after I watched that Alan Moore video. Now, first I have to say that I've read other of Joe Hill's books and I've really enjoyed them. And I actually really like the premise of The Fireman. It's an apocalyptic novel about dragon scale, an infection that causes the appearance of these scabby, scale-like growths on the body that looks like lizard skin. Ultimately, dragon scale is fatal because it causes the victims to spontaneously combust, which is terrifying. And in the hands of Joe Hill, who I think is a great writer, I was really looking forward to this one. But it didn't work for me for a number of reasons. Which brings us to lesson number 3. Tell your story from the right point of view. The protagonist of The Fireman is Harper, who is a very, very boring person. Her most interesting qualities is that she's a school nurse, she's pregnant, and she likes Julie Andrews. The pregnancy angle makes her sort of a sympathetic character in the face of a global apocalyptic pandemic. But in an apocalypse, everybody's a sympathetic character, so it didn't really win her too many points in my mind. So who would I have picked from this novel to be my POV character? I didn't really think any of the characters were good enough to be a POV. If you've read the book, you might be thinking John the fireman would be the right choice for the POV character. John's a little more interesting, maybe because he has the ability to control the dragon scale spore. But he's moody and reclusive and doesn't want to have anything to do with anybody. So how can he really be a POV character? He's more driven to hide from society, which doesn't give him a lot of purpose. So you can have a moody, reclusive POV character like Batman, but without a purpose like Batman has to rid Gotham City of crime. But without that sense of purpose to drive and propel the character forward into the story, you're just left with kind of a nothing of a character. So John is sort of a tool that Joe Hill uses to wield as a plot device, which is fine, but it doesn't make a POV character. And Joe Hill didn't use him as a POV character, but I'm just like searching for this in this book for like, who could have been a POV character. Now, in this novel, the entire world has fallen to this spore, and literally half the world is on fire. So why are we focused on one insular little suburbanite New Hampshire group and their little summer camp political drama? I found myself not caring very much about Harper or John or any of the other people in the camp because Joe Hill created a much more interesting world outside the camp that we only got glimpses of. He created his own mistake. If this spore had only affected a small portion of the world, and we were focused on that portion of the world, maybe New Hampshire got quarantined, and this is just one small group that was fighting to get free, that would have been a lot more interesting. But we got the whole world to choose from. And this is where he chose to like focus in on. It just didn't make any sense to me. It's like you're focusing in on the wrong part of the world here and the wrong people to tell this story. They're boring people. All right, sticking with the firemen, we're going to move on to lesson number 4. Working within self-imposed limitations breeds more creativity than total free reign. In reading The Fireman, it felt like Joe Hill couldn't decide whether the dragon scale was a scientifically explainable disease or a supernatural fantasy disease that gave people superpowers. I would have been fine with either, but not both. Don't spend page after page after page trying to explain how a certain enzyme prevents the destruction of a fungi's reproduction mechanism by fire and how the body adopts it as a fire retardant, only then to harness your disease and manifest a literal fiery demon like a sorcerer. Hard science fiction or loosey-goosey with the fantasy? I'm happy with either one, but I am not happy with both. We've heard this a million times, and it's absolutely true. Constraint breeds creativity. Open ranges only serve to engender rabbit trails that distract the author and bore the reader. Lesson 5. Random details do not equal reality. The Fireman contained too many random details that signified nothing. Specifically, it seemed that every single character, main character and side character alike, had these oddball traits. This guy wore Christmas sweaters all year round. This person idolized Julie Andrews. This person sucks on stones. This person who works for the city and has a limited budget rides a unicycle to work and keeps a $500 bottle of bourbon in his house. Now, this latter man with the $500 bottle of bourbon is not described at any point being like a bourbon aficionado. It's just at one point in the book he needed to be able to impress a guest, and so he just whips out this super expensive bottle of bourbon. He just happened to have it lying around. I mean, come on. You know what I happen to have lying around? Hold on a second. I am also a city employee, and this is the whiskey that I can afford. This is a bottle of Jameson. It costs $21, $22. This is what you would expect to find in the house of somebody who works for the city. This is pretty cheap, all right? And this is what you would expect somebody with a limited means to have in their house. Now, does that mean that I have never spent more than $22 on a bottle of booze? Of course not. I've splurged before, but never in my life have I spent $500 on a bottle of bourbon. Now, some people have, and it's not beyond total believability that somebody who worked for the city might have a $500 bottle of bourbon that they're keeping on hand for special occasions. And if that was the one kind of oddball trait that one of the characters and the fireman had, I'd let it slide and I would have forgotten about it completely by now. But every single character in this book had an oddball trait like that. It was like reading a random character generator every time somebody walked onto the page. My advice, Joe, you're a really good author. Just sort of rein it in for the next one. The next book on this list is The Cartographers by Peng Shepherd. And I'm not 100% sure I'm pronouncing that name right. But this book is, at its core, an urban fantasy with magical map making at the center of the premise. This really was one of the worst books I've ever read in my life. If I was going to do a serious deep dive review of the cartographers, I would have to go through it again, take some notes, and bring the receipts. I could easily do an hour-long video on just this book alone. When I first read this book, I got the distinct impression that I'd stumbled across some sort of knockoff genre fiction that was aspiring to be some kind of like hip Dan Brown wannabe for readers who were trying to break like a 20-year Harry Potter addiction. I was actually basically texting my mom, who's reading the book at the same time as me. And so we were texting each other back and forth what our thoughts were as we were reading. And very few of our text messages were of a very positive nature. My mother hated this book as well. Which brings me to lesson number 6. The book has to make sense, even if only relative to the premise the author establishes. So many things in the cartographers made zero sense, but the main mechanics at the center of the premise was the worst offender. All right, without going into too much detail, in this magical map-making fantasy world that Shepard wrote, a person is able to create a whole new pocket of reality set aside from reality simply by drawing a single one-off map of that new pocket reality. It's like a division of reality set aside from the real world. All right, so I'm actually going to design a little graphic for this and put it up on the screen here so this kind of makes sense. All right, so you've got a room. In reality, this is what the room looks like, okay? And so Eric comes into the room, and Eric has drawn a special map of this room that has a secret room attached to the back of the room with a door that does not actually exist. But he's got the map that he drew. It's a one-off map of this room. And since he possesses this one-off map of the room, he is able to access this little pocket reality, and that door exists for him in this set-aside little pocket reality. For everybody else who does not possess the map, that door does not exist. Okay? So Eric can disappear inside that room and nobody else can find Eric. So Eric is invisible to everybody else. All right? You following that? So that is the basic premise for this. The thing is, this is a reality that exists worldwide and anybody can do it. The fact that almost nobody in the world knows about this, and it is an enormous secret that only a handful of people known as the cartographers know about, is completely laughable, because the number of cartographers in this book it's a handful. It's like, I don't remember how many it was. It was maybe 5 or 8 people total in the world that even know that this is possible. But if creating pockets of extra reality was possible simply by drawing a picture of it, everybody would know about this. It doesn't make any sense. But the nonsense didn't stop there. There is a tech billionaire CEO who's living under an assumed identity. In this day and in this age, paying taxes, living among the world, pretending to be somebody else, and nobody figured it out. That only happens in the world of like assassins and fugitives. You can't live at the top of society under an assumed identity. It doesn't work like that. I mean, at least I don't buy it. Do you? I don't know, maybe I'm not selling this well enough. Maybe I would have to do a deep dive to really explain why this book was so bad and how nothing makes sense. The cartographers had a lot of potential, but in execution it was, I don't know, it was like a belly flop into an empty pool. All right, up next is The Andromeda Strain by Michael Crichton. All right, now this actually wasn't really that terrible of a book, but it wasn't great either. There are worse Crichton books, but the Andromeda Strain brings us to lesson number 7. The reader should care about how the book is going to end. This is one of the rare instances where I think the movie adaptation of the book was better. The movie made me care about what was going to happen to the characters. In the book, after the opening, there's not a lot of development of the story, and very little of the development of the plot has anything to do with the characters. There's very, very little plot, in fact, and most of the story has to do largely with a technical analysis of the Andromeda Strain. And while this analysis was sublimely inventive and kept me reading all the way to the end, it didn't make me care about anybody that was in the book. Crichton wrote about lab work. Crichton wrote about government investigations. Had he written about lab workers and government investigators and personified characters conducting lab work and government investigations and made it a human story, that would have been so much more entertaining and gripping, and I would have been with it until the end. But it was just technical. Bottom line, by the end of the book, I didn't really care one way or another whether the nuke went off. And that's probably not a very good indicator that I was engaged with the novel. And it seems like Michael Crichton probably learned a lesson from writing Andromeda Strain. I don't know if you know this, but he went on to become one of the best-selling authors of all time. So, you know, good for him. All right, we've got 2 more books and 3 more lessons. And the next 2 lessons comes from The Wanderers by Chuck Wendig. Now, in The Wanderers, 2 distinct medical phenomena converge. One, a group of otherwise healthy people just get up and start walking west, completely unresponsive to external stimuli, like they're just walking like robots. And 2, a disease spread by bats reaches the general populace and becomes a global pandemic. Where have we heard that story before? This is pre-COVID, by the way. And quick side note, The Wanderers was one of 3 pandemic books that I read during COVID. I read The Wanderers, The Stand, and Severance. This was the worst one. But The Wanderers isn't the worst book that's on this list. It wasn't even the worst book I read that year. It just could have been a lot better. And that brings us to lesson number 8. Subplots ought not to be more compelling than the main story. Now, the CDC is on the scene for the Wanderers heading west and for the global pandemic. And this handheld AI device, I thought, was more interesting than anything else that was happening in the book for at least the first 2/3 of the novel. Every time they started using the AI device, I was more interested in what was happening with that than I was with anything else, and it was really distracting, and I wanted to know more about that. Your subplot shouldn't be more compelling than your main plot. And if it is, write a book about that instead. This actually happened to me in a book that I was writing called Project ULW. I too was writing a book with a subplot with an AI assistant, and that AI assistant was way more interesting than the main plot, which was like this runaway technology thing that was not related to the AI. The AI assistant was just my excuse for how the billionaire character made all of his money. And the billionaire was now funding this other project, which was the main story of the book. But like the AI thing that he created was way more interesting than the new project that he was doing. And my beta readers who read it were really disappointed that they didn't get to read more about the AI assistant, which was called Mix James. And Mix James would have been a better book than Project ULW, but I never got around to writing that. So that's a lesson that I learned for myself. And reading the first 2/3 of The Wanderers was really reminiscent of my own failure. So I wanted to include that here. All right, lesson 9. Characters' motivations should be comprehensible. The depth and believability of the characters in Wanderers was severely imbalanced. One of the main characters is a preacher named Matthew, and Matthew gets roped in to vocally support a very violent alt-right group through these appearances on TV and podcast episodes. Now, Matthew not only was a godly man, but he was a good man. He wasn't supposed to be portrayed as a hypocritical godly man who did bad things despite the fact that he was in a position where he's supposed to be a good person. He was supposed to be a good person and a godly man who got swept up and was just weak. He was weak, and he was very easily manipulated. He was he was very easily manipulated into vocally supporting this alt-right group to the masses. He knew that he was making mistakes along the way, but he didn't stop, because I think that would have just been inconvenient for Chuck Wendig's plot in the direction that the book was going at the time. Not because it was a good character choice, because eventually Matthew did just stop, but only when it was easy for him to do it. It wasn't a good character. It wasn't like meaningful for him in any way. And I never was able to comprehend his motivations for betraying the goodness inside of himself. It didn't make any sense. Now, there's maybe a little bit of justification because his son was getting caught up in this alt-right group. I don't know, and maybe he was hoping that the group wasn't really as bad as they thought it. I don't know. He knew what he was doing. However, there were some other characters, specifically a couple of the CDC doctors in the book, who were very well-rounded, three-dimensional characters, and I was able to comprehend their motivations right from the get-go. And they were very fun to read. But then there were other characters who seemed to be guided by random forces instead of by any kind of core beliefs. It was a very mixed bag. All right, last book is Dreamcatcher by Stephen King. Now, Dreamcatcher starts off as a real hoot. 4 lifelong friends retreat to a cabin in the wintry woods for an annual kind of bro weekend. They're celebrating kind of extra hard this year because one of the 4 friends celebrated a near-death experience, and his survival has kind of reinvigorated their sort of lust for life. King paints this very cozy atmosphere up in the North Woods, but then offsets it with this kind of quintessential King-style coarseness and vulgarity that is really unique to his style of books. King is kind of at the height of his powers when he writes these kind of unbridled characters. And the first, I don't know, maybe 200 pages of Dreamcatcher are some of the best stuff that he's written. I loved the first part of this book. Which brings us to lesson number 10. Think twice about finishing a book drastically different from the way you start it. So Dreamcatcher starts off with King at his best. But things go awry at the cabin when a very, very sick hunter shows up at the cabin. The hunter is infected with a very particularly disgusting kind of alien spore that erupts out of his body in one of the most graphically disturbing scenes that King has ever written. And I'm here for it. That was gross, and it was a lot of fun. But then things start going downhill really fast in the novel, because then enters the military quarantine. The middle third of the book sees the surviving friends taken prisoner in kind of a military zealot sort of story. And then the final third of the book depicts a mad dash back to the friends' hometown so they can find a 5th friend from their childhood who has psychic abilities, and maybe they think that he can save them from the military zealots who's chasing them down on the highway. So we've got aliens, we've got military quarantine, we've got the North Woods, we've got a military zealot, we've got highway chases, we've got telepathy and psychic abilities. And the Dreamcatcher just ends so vastly different from the way that it starts, it's like reading a totally different book. It'd be like, you start reading a book about the Titanic and then it ends, with the Apollo mission or something. Like, what just happened here? Okay, so that's the first 10 lessons that I learned from reading bad books. And not all these books were really all that bad. Some of them were really bad. Some were worse than others. But I've got a lot more lessons for several more videos, so if you like this, let me know in the comments. Like this video. Let me know if you agreed or disagreed with my assessment of these books. What were some of the bad books that you've read, and tell me why. What about those bad books did you not like? All right, thanks for watching Gronsky Books. I have been Eric Gronsky, and I'll see you in the next one.